Welcome to Connections, bringing together King's Business School's sharpest minds with first-hand insight from leaders in the world of business, public service, science and beyond.
Welcome to the Connections podcast from King's Business School. Today's episode is brought to you by the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance, King's Business School's latest research centre dedicated to the study of central banks and the challenges they face in the global environment. Today I am pleased to welcome Dr Francesca Monti, the Deputy Director of the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance and former Head of Modelling in the Monetary Analysis Directorate at the Bank of England. Joining her today as a special guest is Dame Colette Bowe, who is an external member of the Financial Policy Committee at the Bank of England and trustee of both the Nuffield Foundation and the IFRS Foundation. This episode will discuss women in central banking.
Thank you, Ruth, for the introductions. And thank you very much, Colette, for joining me in this podcast on this topic, which I consider very important.
Hello, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, Francesca. Ruth mentioned at the beginning that I'm an external member of the Financial Policy Committee at the Bank of England, but I've also worked for a long time in various roles in the financial services sector, both in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. And before that, I had a career working for the UK government and also in different kinds of regulation. So I've done a few different things, and I'm looking forward to sharing a few points with you this afternoon, Francesca.
Women are underrepresented in the field of economics. Central banks tend to employ those who have studied economics, so this disparity then continues when it comes to staff numbers and the number of women then working in central banking. According to the 2020 Gender Balance Index by the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, 1/5 of central banks have no women working in senior positions. Only 14 central banks globally are headed by women, including the European Central Bank, which is led by Christine Lagarde, its first female president. 15% of central banks reserve seats for women on their board of directors or monetary policy board, and 54% have implemented a gender diversity program. Now, both of you have phenomenal careers in central banking. You both have PhDs in economics and have worked at leading central banks. What are your thoughts on these stats, and what have both of your experiences been like working in central banking?
Well, I'll kick off, and I'd like to go back to an interesting point you started with, which was women studying economics. And I know that this is a topic that is not just an issue in this country, but in others as well. And I have to say, it always puzzles me. There are a lot of distinguished women economists. There are a lot of occupants of economics chairs who are women, but still women students don't seem to be opting for economics. And I'm not sure we really understand why. Francesca, I don't know whether from your experience in academic life, you've got any clues to that, because it really puzzles me.
It is something that I think needs to be addressed, and more thought needs to be put in that. I do think there is a general, lack of women in most STEM degrees, and economics, which more and more tends to be very quantitative, therefore tends to attract less women. So this is probably one of the aspects that we needs to be addressed, to kind of make sure that women are confident and interested in approaching areas that are more quantitative as well.
Yes, I'd agree with that, Francesca. And you've given me a good thought there, which is, I think we all need to think about the way in which we get it across to students who are at the school stage, who are choosing subjects. about what the real importance of economics is as an area of study, that it isn't just about, arid, a sort of version of mathematics, important though that is, but that it's crucial for understanding what's going on in our society. But to take it back to where we started on central banking, I must say, as an economist, when the invitation came to me to join the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England, I thought it was one of the most interesting challenges one could have. As you both know, the Financial Policy Committee is a relatively new, it's a relative innovation, not hugely new, but it's a post financial crisis innovation. And in terms of its contribution to ensuring the financial stability of not just this banking system, but all the others with which we are interconnected, it could not be more interesting. So one of the things I would like to do is to say to anybody, be they girls or indeed boys who are listening to this podcast, if you're wondering whether economics is a career for you, I can tell you, if you pursue it and end up in a central bank doing something like financial stability, it could not be more interesting. So think about it now.
I must admit, I definitely agree. And I relate this a lot to my experience. So I chose to go into doing a PhD in economics and statistics exactly because I was interested in working in a central bank, and in particular in public service. My goal was to make a positive difference in society. And I think you're right that we need to do a better job in explaining how indeed monetary policy and policies that address the issue of financial stability and macroprudential regulation are indeed affecting society. Maybe there is a disconnect there between how people perceive these type of jobs, or the role of these institutions versus how impactful they can be on society and in making the world a better place.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Francesca. A bit like you when I was making career choices, and this is going back a bit because I'm now in my 70s. My first job after my PhD was working for the British government. And I chose to go and work for them because at that period, which was the middle of the 1970s, the British economy was in pretty dire straits. And we had great and difficult to address economic problems facing us as a country. And to me, it seemed like the most important challenge one could have was to think, how on earth can one support the government in getting through this this terrible crisis we're in? So a bit like you, Francesca, I chose my first job on the grounds that this was going to be something where I could make a bit of a difference. I'm not sure I did personally. I was a very junior person, very junior member of the team. At the same time, it was great. It gave me a great ringside seat at in a period of our political life which was extremely important. And then and I also saw what a contribution economics could make to understanding the deep drivers of what was going on. And I've never regretted that career choice. And it led me through a long path towards now being at the central bank, having done various other things along the way. If there are any women listening to this podcast who are thinking, shall I do this or shall I do something else? I'll tell you what really floated my boat. It was when, as a young student, I began to understand all those things that were in the newspapers all the time and on the media about, the difficult challenges the government was facing in managing a big deficit, and, should they raise taxes or should they not? And how do you stimulate the economy? All of that. And, it was a period when that was really, in a way, all anybody could talk about, because it was, as I've said, it was an extreme. The 1970s are a very, very difficult period in economic policy. And the thing that I really loved about doing economics was I slowly began to understand through the study of macroeconomics, actually, I began to understand what it was I was seeing and hearing all the time. So I didn't feel sort of like a sort of passive recipient of things. I started to feel I could have an opinion about this. I could form a view. Maybe this policy is right. Maybe this policy is wrong.
I can very much relate to that. And the other point that I would add to this is that for people thinking of choosing a profession which can allow them to do something that affects society positively, there's always the trade-off between thinking of doing it as at a very micro level, for example, volunteering to help the homeless. So that's a very kind of direct way of thinking about this. But there's also a much more macro level, indeed, to this, where you can ask the question of, can supporting the decisions of people like Colette, or indeed being in the position of making decisions like the one that Colette makes, can that help shape the world in a positive way? And I think the answer is yes.
Another point, Francesca, and again, I don't know whether you find this when you're talking to your students at King's College, but of course, I haven't been what you would call a professional economist all my career by any means. And I moved after I stopped working for the British government. I went into working in city regulation, and then from there I progressed to, or I don't know whether it was a progression, but I moved on to working in the city itself in a fund management business, as you know, where economists very often work. So I wasn't really then working as an economist, but, and this is a really crucial point, having the formation of an economist, having an economics training, having my mind formed in a way that thinks in economic terms has been enormously helpful in every job I've done. There are all sorts of things that we take for granted as economists that are just massively helpful when you're trying to think about problem solving of various kinds, for example. And, I've always thought that being trained as an economist helped you not only to think about sort of quite basic concepts like opportunity cost, but also be prepared to think in sort of general equilibrium terms as well. And in any job I've done, I have found that to be absolutely vital. One of the things I would say to potential students of economics listening to this is, of course, studying economics is a great foundational discipline, and it can form the basis of a very interesting career that might not be in economics.
Thank you. Women are estimated to make up 45% of employees at central banks, according to an article from centralbanking.com. We have also seen women rise to the most senior roles in central banking over the last few years. For example, Janet Yellen becoming the first woman to lead the Federal Reserve over in America, and also now the first woman to serve as Treasury Secretary. There is also Christine Lagarde, who is now president of the European Central Bank. These are phenomenal achievements and breakthroughs for women. What impact do you think these achievements have had on the sector?
I find it a bit hard to say what impact have they had on the sector as yet, to be honest. For precisely the reason that you mentioned, Ruth, these are just both phenomenally talented people. And their leadership of these, first of all, both central banks and now Janet Yellen at the US Treasury, is remarkable. That's because they're remarkable people. They are powerful role models for other younger women. When I began my career, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it was almost inconceivable that a woman would have been in the sort of position that Janet Yellen or Christine Lagarde is today. There was a total absence of senior female role models in the sort of things that I and my friends were choosing to do. And I think I think the role model part of this is really important. If you can see that other women have succeeded in getting to the highest rungs of the career ladder that you're on, it's impossible to overstate the importance of that. And that's where I think the real impact of Christine Lagarde and Janet Yellen will be.
That is definitely also the key for me. I definitely agree the importance of having these new women achieving these very senior roles has mostly to do with providing female role models and having people to aspire to be like. Maybe I would also add that just having a more diverse group of people can in some sense guard against groupthink, because it brings some heterogeneity and values and attitudes. I tend to agree with you that what makes a person like Janet Yellen in her role special is not that she's a woman, but that she's an exceptionally talented woman. But I also do think that having decisions taken by groups of people that are not uh, all too similar tend to be better.
I think I would want to challenge you a bit about whether having some women around necessarily means that you haven't got groupthink. And by the way, this is not remotely about the two individuals we've discussed. This is about women in general. I mean, I have sat on boards where, irrespective of the gender or ethnicity makeup of the board, practically everybody has been to the same sort of universities, has had the same sort of earlier education, and now lives the same sort of life. And I don't regard that as particularly, diverse. I think diversity is, the fact that you might be of a different gender or different ethnicity of some of the other people in the room doesn't necessarily mean that you think differently. And I sort of feel that diversity is a lot to do with what people have got going on in their heads. But that said, I think and I think where it's important, actually, and this brings us on to women on boards, I think it's very important for people working in any organization, and this is not just central banks, but any institution. And when we look around the financial services sector, you can see there are very few women at the top. If people inside the business see that the people who are on the board, the people who are leading the business, are diverse in gender terms, diverse in ethnicity terms, I think people in the business think, that could be me one of these days. And that's why I think it's important.
I agree.
The European Central Bank is creating initiatives to support career progression of women within the institution. Central banking and the banking sector in general are still very male-dominated sectors. Women and men both make up the economy, so having a balanced view, with women's voices being heard, is incredibly important. What do you think can be done to address the gender bias in the sector?
So I think one of the key aspects, which we were discussing before, is that indeed not very many females or women study economics. And indeed, for example, women account for 1/3 of PhD graduates in economics, but the number is much lower when you look into macroeconomics and finance, which are obviously very important topics, for example, in central banks. So the pool of potential, applicants is male dominated. That would suggest that promoting, the study of economics and, more quantitative subjects is really important. And indeed, for example, the European Central Bank is doing that with a Women in Economics scholarship that they launched in 2019. The other very interesting point is that studies have found that while at entry level, for example, in central banks, at the ECB in particular, because this is a study of the ECB, women and men enter the entry percentages are equivalent to the ones that come out from the PhD or graduate. As soon as you start looking at career progressions, the career progression of women tends to slow down and be slower, and part of this is attributed to in some sense women not pushing themselves forward enough for promotions, and so in that sense, having role models and mentoring programs, both by men or by women, but definitely mentoring programs that can support women in the working environment is crucial. And finally, another reason for the falling share of female economists over the course of the career trajectory is they tend to face harsher trade-offs between family and career obligations, or family and career responsibilities. And so supporting that, for example, ensuring effective childcare could be a way of addressing these issues. I don't know, Colette, what you think about my views.
It's endemic in financial services sector. It's endemic in other professions like the law, where you have equal numbers, broadly speaking, of young people joining. And then as their careers progress, you find, for various reasons that you've just touched on, the women fall behind or even leave and don't come through to the top echelons. And there are always a number of reasons for this. You've mentioned mentoring, which I'd quite like to come back to, because I think that's a very interesting one to talk about. But there's also the reality that people have to make decisions about family life, about childcare, about all of those things. And one of the very, very interesting discussions at the moment, I think, and this has been driven by the way all of our working lives have been affected by COVID, is whether changes in future working patterns will be such that the issues that many women have had to cope with in their 30s and 40s, let's say, when they've had to make hard choices about how they prioritize their careers versus their families, or vice versa. Maybe new acceptable patterns of work in the future will enable us to recast those difficult choices. And we might well see somewhat different patterns of senior female employment emerging. It'll be very, very interesting to see what happens. So what I've observed, Francesca, through my career is that this problem we're talking about of women not always breaking through as their abilities deserve is not just confined to central banking. Actually, it's a widespread phenomenon. And sometimes it reflects difficult choices that couples make about how they're going to run their domestic and family lives. But perhaps new working patterns that are going to emerge will change some of these difficult choices. And wouldn't that be great if that was one of the things that happened?
I'm absolutely very hopeful about that, indeed. I think it's very early days, and there are a lot of studies looking into this and the effects of this pandemic on the labor market and female labor market participation, and indeed also on issues about how the new ways of working have affected or are affecting work culture.
I feel hopeful too, Francesca, and actually I think one of the important things that we all ought to be thinking about now, in whatever sector we're working in, is okay, how are we going to use this to the advantage of our colleagues? How are we going to make sure that what we've learned about how people can work productively while being, working in a dispersed way, how can we really turn that to our collective advantage as a society? And I know this is not something that everybody will want to do, and I know not all jobs are in the fortunate position of being able to make these kind of choices. But for the sort of sectors that we're talking about at the moment, I think employers have got a big responsibility now to think, okay, how are we going to make sure that all of our talented recruits, especially including the female ones, actually get a chance to come through and shine?
Indeed. I I really hope that there's going to be more thought put into this.
While the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely ushered a change in working patterns and work culture, some of which will hopefully be permanent. Colette, based on your experiences in this sector, what advice would you give to women just starting their career journey in this area, and also to those aspiring to study and work in economics and banking?
Ruth, I've got 2 or 3 sort of top tips I would give. First of all, there are no shortcuts to professional formation in this sort of field. So you do have to do the right sort of training. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a degree. It doesn't necessarily have to be in economics. But if you want to work in the financial sector, be it in the commercial part or in central banking, then you have got to make darn sure that you've invested in your own training and development. You can't sort of slide through without really having done that. So that's number one. Number two, and we've touched on this a bit, is look out for people who can mentor you. And don't be afraid to ask people to do that. Over my career, I've had some terrific mentors. And when I look back, near all but one of them have been men who I was working for and who were good enough to give me advice, encouragement, support, and importantly, tell me when I was making a bit of a hash of things, which is not always the easiest thing. Being a mentor doesn't always mean telling somebody that they're great. You sometimes have to tell people that they're not going about things in the way they should. And I've been very fortunate to have some very good colleagues like that. And I think the final thing I would say is don't let yourself be discouraged. Life doesn't always run smoothly. Career paths don't always run smoothly. Sometimes you get a bit knocked back. Well, dust yourself down, pick yourself up and say, what have I learned from that experience? What can I get out of it? How am I going to take that on to the next thing I'm going to do? And don't let things, don't sort of, as people will say, don't sweat the small stuff as well. Don't worry too much about things that don't matter very much. So that would be my top tips. Training, look out for mentors, and try and keep a balanced approach, but remembering that not every career goes totally smoothly, and sometimes you just need to pick yourself up and dust yourself down and start again.
Well, I must admit that I just feel like echoing Colette on all her points. When I was thinking about this question, indeed, I had put training as the key issue. That is, you do need to have what it takes to perform a job of this type. But, also mentoring and is really important. Having the support of the people that work around you, support, but also a guidance and, having people that can tell you what you're doing well and where you need to work harder or, do better. And the final thing I had in mind, which relates very much to what Colette was saying, but is not exactly the same, is to be confident and maybe a little bit more assertive than you would be comfortable with. In this sense. I think that is probably if talking about my experience, I think that is one of the things that is important.
Fully agree, Francesca. Yep.
This episode was brought to you by the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance. If you'd like to learn more about the Centre, please visit our webpage on the King's College London website. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Connections. Subscribe for more insights into the issues shaping business, the economy, and society.